As part of the organizing committee for CMLCA, I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon. So I think since there is two of you, remember we'll try to keep this like the presentations very brief. I think it's about 5 minutes, just so we can have a lot of time for the conversation.
Right, we'll be sort of presenting together.
Presenters, and good afternoon to our presenters and everybody in attendance on behalf of the CMLCA Organizing Committee. Raul Alberto Mora, broadcasting today from Medellin, Colombia, honoring at the land of the Zenú, the Kunatuli, and the Embera. And today we have a beautiful panel featuring John Collins and Cassandra Kunert called Weaving the Streets, Citizen Journalism at the Intersection of Art and Politics. The dynamics of the session will be John and Cassandra will give the remarks, and then they will lead us into conversation. So can we just, can we stop already sharing the screen? So thank you. So we can now, John and Cassandra, you can share your screen if you like. And everybody, welcome to this session. And I'm personally very excited about all the conversations we're going to have in this. John, Cassandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raul. It's lovely to be here. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to do a quick screen share here to get us going. Are we okay with the screen share? Does everything look all right for everyone?
It looks like we're actually seeing the speaker view, so we're seeing like your notes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point out. Yes.
Okay, I should be able to swap that out. Just give me 1 second.
Perfect.
Better?
Better, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for pointing that out. So this is a session on Weaving the Streets, citizen journalism at the intersection of art and politics. We're just going to begin by telling you all a bit about ourselves and the organization that we work with, which is Weave News. And Weave News has been around since 2007. It's a project that began at St. Lawrence University, where I teach, and came out of a seminar that I was teaching at the time in global news analysis. And the students in that particular year were very interested in a sort of praxis-oriented approach to media studies, and decided that they wanted to create a platform for investigating and writing about stories that are either underreported or poorly reported by corporate media, sometimes called mainstream media. And so the organization has grown significantly since then, but still maintains that original focus on underreported stories. And we're still grounded to some extent at St. Lawrence University. So my name is John Collins. I teach in the Global Studies Department here at St. Lawrence, and I'm currently serving as the editorial director for Weave News. And I'll let Cassandra introduce herself.
So my name is Cassandra. I just graduated from St. Lawrence University in the Global Studies and the government programs. So Dr. Collins was my undergraduate advisor, and I joined the Weave News during my junior year as a street team member for the Weaving the Streets project, and I have since taken on the role of the contributing editor. So I'm really excited to be here talking about the project because it's something I'm really passionate about, and I'm really excited to share all of the hard work we have been doing and to get everybody's input if anybody has anything to give.
Wonderful, and we do view this session very much as a dialogue session. We'll be speaking briefly about some aspects of the project itself, showing a few examples of the kinds of work that we've been doing over the last few years with Weaving the Streets. But really the main point is to reflect on where this project is right now. It's beginning to mature as a project, and we continue to confront a number of different issues, ethical issues having to do with representation, and sort of ethics of doing transnational journalistic work in the context of a private university in the United States. And we're really seeking to hear from participants today about the project, what you think of the project, how it can be improved as we move forward into the next phase of it. So those are some of our goals today. Really, we want to talk about how citizen journalism through this kind of project can contribute to that Freirean project of collectively building consciousness, building critical consciousness, in particular in the interest of promoting a solidarity-based politics across national borders. Again, we'll look at some examples from our project, Weaving the Streets, think about some of those challenges that I mentioned, and then open up for some dialogue about the role that projects like this that do citizen journalism work can play in different kinds of educational practice. And we'll be very excited to hear from all of you as we do so. So a few words about Weaving the Streets. This is a multimedia project grounded in the concept of citizen journalism. It was launched in 2013 as a collaboration between the Weave News organization, which I mentioned earlier, and our friends at the Richard F. Brush Art Gallery. And the mission of that project of Weaving the Streets is to kind of explore the ways in which ordinary people use public space to express themselves in ways that reflect engagement with contemporary social and political issues. So it's very much about public space understood as a site of struggle between different social forces. And participants in this project, who tend to be undergraduates or recent graduates, use techniques such as participant observation, digital photography, videography, and traditional journalistic interviewing to document what's happening in the streets and the locations where they are. And in many cases, these are students who are spending a semester studying in another country. And so they're sort of documenting what they're seeing in the streets, what's happening in the streets, and then trying to contextualize what they're seeing through the eyes and the words of locals. And the project is built upon the belief that social justice it sort of requires an active interrogation of power knowledge relationships, not simply consumption of dominant media images. So a lot of the work that we do involves kind of working with students to understand some of the limitations of those dominant media images and how we need to sort of make visible things that are often invisible or suppressed in those media narratives. And so this project in particular highlights how ordinary people can and do raise their voices, even in contexts where public space is often privatized, surveilled, and controlled. So this project illustrates how the work of citizen journalism can contribute directly to the process of what the conference organizers call developing and empowering critical, caring, nurturing, and conscientious people. Cassandra?
Yeah, so the contributors to the project, as Dr. Collins just mentioned, are typically students and young alumni from St. Lawrence University, since that is where the project was born. But the nature of the project is to conduct fieldwork abroad. So the contributors do tend to be on a semester abroad on a program through the university, but not always. And we really want to stress that we're open to proposals from anybody, not just those who are affiliated with St. Lawrence University, where Weave News first emerged, but to anyone who has something to contribute. We have an open proposal policy, and we would love to hear any ideas for projects or issues that are going on wherever you are. And we are currently on our 14th cohort of contributors for the project, which is very exciting. And we have 2 really exciting projects being drafted right now, and we're really looking forward to publishing them and sharing all the hard work that's going on now. And we do compensate our contributors for their work, for both their articles that are published through the Weave News and for the artifacts that they collect for our People's History Archive, which is the Weaving the Streets sister project. And so our People's History Archive has a mission to document the creative and complex ways in which ordinary people make use of public space. So it has a really similar theme to Weaving the Streets, but contributors find physical handheld materials in order to document these sorts of activities that are scanned and added to a digital archive online. And the website is listed on the slide in case anyone is interested in visiting. It's a very interesting archive. Many forms of street culture are ephemeral in nature, which creates a methodological challenge to collecting materials and reminds us why it is so important to gather them before they're lost, forgotten, or destroyed. And a lot of the materials have been announcements, flyers, posters, stickers, things like that. But other forms of creative expression, such as signs and silk screens, cloth, have been contributed before. During my project, I contributed police tape from the 2019 protests in Lebanon that broke out in October, which is pictured on the slide. It can be anything that represents public expression or life. We're very open, but like archives elsewhere, our People's History Archive represents and reveals the interests, values of societies, cultures, and subcultures, which the materials in the archive are drawn from. However, the project undoubtedly reflects the values that include commitments to civil rights, social justice, equity, and fairness for the greater good of all members of the society. And so we really stress collectivity, and we have a very intimate relationship with social justice in the materials that we're archiving for this project. You want to change the slide, Dr. Collins?
Yeah.
So we're going to jump right into some really cool examples from years past that contributors have worked on. And so these images are from a contributor named Brendan Riley. He was in Freiburg, Germany, and he contributed a 3-part series to the project dedicated to I don't speak German, but I'm going to try to pronounce this, the Deitenbach decision, which would bulldoze farmland to build a residential neighborhood in Freiburg, Germany, while he was studying there. He wrote that this proposed residential neighborhood, to be called Deitenbach, would replace 25 hectares of farmland with housing for around 15,000 people. And this was a really contentious issue in this local place, but it wasn't an issue that was getting a lot of international attention at the time. And Brendan's series looked at the pro and anti-build arguments surrounding the local referendum. And he used posts and demonstrations to construct a comprehensive understanding of Freiburg's values, which is most important to their hearts and to their visions and what they are willing to sacrifice, which are words that I drew from his article. And I just think that this was a really amazing example of how this project has been used in the past to express local social justice issues and to express both sides in a comprehensive way while on the ground and working with materials in different lenses than we typically see in what Dr. Collins mentioned earlier as the corporate or the mainstream media. And so if you want to switch slides, I'll switch gears to the next example. So these images are actually from my own project. So while I studied abroad in Jordan, I wrote a series of standalone articles. My first article was, in my opinion, the most politically impactful one that I wrote. And it was also the most difficult one to write for that reason. I think Dr. Collins and our other team member, Kathy Tedford, and I must have gone through 5 different drafts before finalizing it, both because I was a new writer and because it was such an important topic. I wrote about the October 2019 protests that broke out in Lebanon, which broke out hours after I had landed in Beirut to conduct research for my planned series of articles that were going to be on Beirut's famous street art scene. But things obviously took a turn once I was on the ground. And I had a few of the most impactful days of my life while I was in Lebanon. And I was able to write through the lens of the city's street art. So my following articles focused on Amman's growing street art scene and on the use of traditional calligraphy therein. But while they were all standalone articles, they still had common themes among them. They were very focused on the ground political movements and social systems that were operating. And although they were in different geographic spaces and different topically, I think a lot of the articles that are contributed to this project tend to have those themes connecting them and connecting those geographies and those events. And so could you switch the slide? And so another example was Savannah Crowley's contribution to Weaving the Streets. So Savannah Crowley has written for Weave News a number of times, but her 2017 contribution to Weaving the Streets, titled Deported Veterans, A Visit to the Bunker, was particularly important. The report from Tijuana was a standalone article, but Savannah has written other pieces for Weaving the Streets as well. In this piece, Savannah writes about the US policy of deporting veterans. Savannah wrote, "I traveled with Jan to learn and see for myself what was happening to these veterans, why there is extremely little coverage of this issue, and what can be done about it. Our first stop in Tijuana was the Deported Veteran Support House, affectionately known as the Bunker." And so stylistically and topically, Brendan's, Savannah's, and my own project differed significantly, as do other contributions to the project, but most Weaving the Streets articles are related to social justice in some form or another, which links each one by a common thematic thread. Dr. Collins.
So a couple of other examples here before we get into some of the questions that we want to raise. This example that you're seeing here is from a student named Ajok Deng, who was studying in Madrid, Spain. And she focused her reporting on feminist mobilizations in Lavapiés, which is a neighborhood in Madrid with a large and very diverse immigrant population and a long history of social movement activity. And artwork painted on the walls in the neighborhood revealed how local activists were responding to a number of cases of sexual violence. And they were responding with messages of solidarity and defiance. And Ajok wrote in one of her articles, quoting here, "In Lavapiés, graffiti call attention to the normalized violence against women in a patriarchal and capitalistic society. It seeks to fracture the pattern of murders and gender violence for male partners. The graffiti takes the stories to the streets or public sphere and puts them in dialogue with those who walk by. Pedestrians are sure to notice the patterns on the walls, which are presented as symbols, images, or text denouncing violence against women. By taking the narratives out of the private sphere, excuse me, the artist activist aims to challenge the term domestic violence, which portrays violence against women as an internal and natural problem." So that's an example from Spain. And then finally, this is the last example we'll show you. This is from Tori Lonergan who was studying in Costa Rica in 2019, at a time when the country was receiving significant numbers of migrants fleeing political violence in neighboring Nicaragua. And Tori found that both traditional artists as well as street artists were responding to these changes by speaking up against xenophobia and authoritarianism. Demonstrations and artistic interventions in public space also revealed sharp divisions within Costa Rican society over the politics of immigration and the meaning of Nicaragua's own revolutionary tradition. And her work provided an excellent opportunity for her as a student to engage firsthand with a very complex ongoing situation where state power and dominant ideologies were colliding with popular mobilization. So those are some examples of the kind of work that this project has supported. So we have a number of questions that we've been reflecting on as a team as we continue to move this project forward. And so these are really the questions that we wanted to bring to this session today for some dialogue and reflection and discussion. And I think the first one is, I know something Cassandra's been thinking a lot about, and so I'll turn things over to you now, Cassandra.
Yeah, so this is a question that we're kind of constantly grappling with at Weave News, and particularly with our project. I know for myself, while I was in Jordan, there was a definite tension in doing this work, which was anticipated by myself and by Dr. Collins and our other team member, Kathy. The power structures around me as an American student put me on this like twisted pedestal that protected me and blinded me from things I wasn't on the ground to see in the same way that locals were, the locals who were experiencing these local impacts of global systems. And so the nature of this project and the institution which supports it, a private university, means that American students, such as myself, many of whom have grown up in wealthy and privileged statuses, are writing the stories instead of locals on the ground. And I can't truly speak for anyone but myself, but knowing the other contributors to this project and to the Weave News more generally, I would assume that they share this sentiment and these concerns, that locals are better suited to tell these stories than we are. So we're dealing with the tension of how then do we conduct this work as responsibly and as ethically as possible, and how do we best navigate this tension in a way that allows students to practice and learn these skills while contributing to social justice efforts on the ground where they're located during their semesters abroad.
I went ahead and stopped the share now so that we can kind of open things up and hear from people attending today about this question that Cassandra has been raising about the ethics, the ethical dilemmas of a project like this, and the difficulties of doing responsible representation.
I have a question. Those are excellent questions. That was very powerful material that you just shared. I'm wondering, I mean, there isn't a way to really like turn the system on its head and answer that question. But I wondered, do you guys bring the local citizens back here to the US to have them do what you're doing with their issues for our issues? I'll just take my answer offline.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, Cassandra, you may have thoughts on this as well. My initial thought on that is that it is part of the vision of this project, certainly, that I think we've always believed that there is value in having a sort of an outside set of eyes and ears brought to a situation. And so, for example, at our university, we do have a lot of international students who come from elsewhere to study with us. And we've always been open to those students exploring issues right here in Northern New York, which is where we're located, as part of this Weaving the Streets project. It's not something that we've, I think, done a lot of yet, but we're certainly open to it and would like to see more of that, because I agree with you that kind of approach would be very powerful. And so, you know, we live and work up here in a rural area. It's a very rural part of the state of New York. And so the kinds of issues, the public space issues here are quite different from many of the urban environments where our students go off and study. And it's really, really interesting to think about what public space means in a place like this.
Mhm.
Cassandra, I know, is also from this part of New York State as well. So you may have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I grew up in Northern New York, which is where St. Lawrence University is located. And like Dr. Collins said, there's a pretty good number of international students at the university who do write about and report on local issues to Northern New York. I know that local issues in Northern New York are something that I'm very passionate about, and that my work of the last year basically has focused on. My senior thesis which Dr. Collins advised me on, was about Northern New York, but I definitely do agree that international students or reporters or contributors, anyone interested in the project, coming to the United States and writing on our issues would be incredible contributions to the project. I think that well, like you said, you can't completely turn a system on its head in a single article, but to publish those perspectives would be very interesting. I think they would have great takes and things that they would probably say things that Americans who are local to the issues in a more long-term way might not have thought about before. And so I think in the same way that our contributors currently are going away from the United States to write on issues and presenting these issues back to their audience, I think in the same way, it would be very powerful for the direction to be going into the United States as well.
We have a question in the chat from Steve, so I'm going to read it out loud. John and Cassandra, have you gotten feedback from the subjects of the reporting about the series?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for joining us, Steve. Steve's an old friend, so it's good to see you here today. Yes, to some extent, but not because we've gone about seeking out that feedback in a systematic way. That's not something that we've, I think, fully built into the project yet. But the main conduit, I guess, for feedback from locals on this work has been actually through either through personal contacts that some of us have in some of these places. For example, Kathy Tedford, who works on this project with us, is very well connected and has done a lot of work herself on street art and sticker art in Germany. And so has gotten some feedback that way. I have contacts in Spain, but also interestingly through our community of our transnational community of students and former students from St. Lawrence, who sort of are attracted to this work because it may be connected with places that are familiar to them or that they call home. And so we do occasionally get feedback from people saying, "Oh, I saw this piece, thanks for bringing light to this issue," or "Here's another perspective that you might want to think about." So we have our own kind of local, I guess, through the university audience and community dialogue going about this, but the systematic process of seeking that feedback, I think is still ahead of us in terms of the next stage of this project. Thanks for the question, Steve.
I really want to get into this conversation. As I said, I didn't want to be just a moderator, but there is one interesting thing when I was listening to Cassandra, and it was she's talking about her positionality as an American person, and I'm thinking about, even in the sense of weaving the streets, how sometimes there are official narratives of the streets, and thinking in terms of the kind of narrative the establishment wants you to weave. I'm thinking in the case, like even in the sense of people coming to Colombia, people coming to Medellin, in a city that has its own history with violence and, still reeling with the legacy of Pablo Escobar. I mean, we're still reeling with that. And sometimes you can see how they kind of want you to go to these neighborhoods as an example of this, and want you to go to the graffiti tour just to see. And so they kind of guide you into certain areas of the city, into certain neighborhoods, and they kind of don't want you to go into others. So I would like to. So my question here is, how can projects like these help combat those official narratives of what the streets look like? Because I think that's what's at stake here. It's how we combat the institutional narrative, the sanitized narratives of the streets, versus showing the reality of the streets, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important question, and something that maybe we haven't totally considered as a project up until now. I think one of the missions of Weave News generally is to combat normative narratives, but I think as a project, and due to the nature of who has contributed to the project up until now, it's been difficult to do that, to combat those sanitized narratives. And I think it's a very real issue. I know that even during my own semester abroad, there were parts of Amman that participants just weren't allowed to, that program participants weren't allowed to go to, due to the study abroad rules of the institution that we were at. And if we had disobeyed those rules, we would have been sent home. And I know even when I was writing my article about the protests in Lebanon, this was something I came upon, was that I wasn't allowed to attend the protests, because if I had attended the protests in Lebanon and my study abroad program found out, I would have been sent home immediately. They were very strict about students not being allowed to attend protests. And so that was something that I was grappling with as writing the article, was that, well, I was talking to local people and people who were there, and I was on the ground in the city, like I was interacting with the protests, but I wasn't attending the protests. I was about a mile away from the protests. And it was a completely different scene where I was. And so that was something I tried to be very honest about in the article, was that I wasn't allowed to be there, but there were pieces of the protest that I was interacting with, just being in the city, and being kind of trapped there as we couldn't get to the airport, and dealing with all of that. And so I think that in a way it can be really difficult to deal with those sanitized narratives, but I think it should be really integral to our mission as a project. And I think it is our aim to do that. And I don't know if Dr. Collins wants to speak any further about that, but that's been my experience with it. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Cassandra, because your project was a great example of this, right? Where you chose to make that part of what you wrote about, right? And we try to encourage our participants to say, you don't have to present yourself as someone who knows everything about this place, or someone who has seen everything that they need to see, but just to be transparent about as much as you can. And another interesting example, we looked earlier at the case from Spain and the neighborhood of Lavapiés in Madrid. This is a neighborhood that, you know, many exchange students and so forth, when they come to study in Madrid, they're often taken there because it's a very multicultural neighborhood. You know, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but it's usually presented to the students in a particular way, right? So I think Raul's question here is appropriate, right? Because Lavapiés is, you know, let's say celebrated for its diversity, and yet a lot of the social mobilization that's happening in the neighborhood is not necessarily brought to the students' attention when they're taken there in sort of official ways, right? So Ajok, who was our student reporter working there, really had to then go back to the neighborhood on her own without anybody accompanying her and kind of framing it for her, and say, I'm just going to talk to people here, and I'm just going to look and see what's on the walls right now and what seems to be happening, and then dig through that on my own. And so she went through a process of having to some extent fight through some of those official narratives of that neighborhood in order to get a sense of what was happening with the feminist mobilizations that were very salient at that time in the neighborhood. Thank you for the question, Raul.
No, I appreciate it. And as I said, I mean, part of my research is I do research on urban literacies and like looking at how like multiple languages help us understand the city. And even you're thinking about this question about the narratives is making me think, when you think about this hybridity, how many cities are there within a city? In the sense of what kinds of narratives we are proposing in cities, and how those narratives seem to overlap: the official narrative, the sanitized narrative, let's say the unofficial narrative, the underground narrative, and how sometimes let's say journalism and even media literacy is, I mean, if we were not careful enough, we can be complicit in sustaining the sanitized narrative, sometimes just by not doing anything. So I think it's an important question for all of us to think, those of us who are in critical media literacy, that the critical implies a social responsibility of unveiling these attempts to guide the narrative in one direction, to veer. I mean, there was a particular, for example, in the case of Cassandra, the fact that they told her, stay here, there is a reason for that. It's because it's not, and you could say, no, it's because we want you to stay safe because you're a foreigner, you want to stay safe, but the real message is, well, we don't want you to stay here because if you go there, you have privilege. And that privilege means you're going to be, once you go home, you're going to tell everybody what really happened. But we're not going to tell you that. We're going to tell you, it's for your safety because you're American and Americans are in danger. So think about all those woven narratives about your positionality and the responsibility we have to think about those particular facts. So that's why I really wanted to have that conversation with the two of you.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is maybe a good time to mention that some of you may have been in the session yesterday that some of our other colleagues from Weave News presented, but the origins of Weave News, actually, the reason we came up with the name Weave for this project, and now 15 years ago almost, was because of the etymological origins of the word context, right, which literally means to weave together. And it's so often context that's lacking in a lot of establishment, media narratives and so forth, right? And so a project like Weaving the Streets is, sort of a humble attempt to begin to provide some of that context that might otherwise be missing. But from a teacher's point of view, I guess I would say as well, the department that I teach in, we've always relied pretty heavily on work of people like Naomi Klein, and her framing of struggles between kind of the forces of privatization and the forces defending the public and the people's rights and the public good. And so that's another part of the context for this project as well, as just encouraging students to have their eyes open, to have their ears open to those struggles between privatization and popular struggles in the places where they're located.
Wonderful. Thank you. Are there any other? We still have about. We got plenty of time, so we're doing really good time. We got still about at least about 20 more minutes, I think. And if the host can help me, if our Aaron can, if the host can remind me if we have. We still have 20 minutes. Sitting session goes till 3 Eastern. I mean, I'm still going. So I get confused. I'm in Central Time. So still have at least 20 minutes. So if anybody wants to join in the conversation, I'm going to take a hint at you that you have to turn his camera on because he wants to be part of the conversation.
Yes, thank you. I'm kind of following up on how the conversation is going. I'm curious about, and I agree with Dr. Mora about the multiple cities within one city. There are layers that who can access which layer and so on. So here I'm thinking about Clifford Geertz's work in anthropology, where he talks about the thick description, where a particular narrative in describing the happenings of the world, one needs to understand the cultural elements in it and describe. So he's arguing sort of against the objective thin narrative that doesn't contain cultural elements. So I was wondering, when in describing or narrating the happenings in those local places, I wonder to what extent reporters are aware of that layer of cultural elements that, sorry, I'm not articulating well enough, but to what extent reporters are encouraged to, I guess, reflect on the constructedness of their narrative and the layers of cultural interpretation that may be missing from the narrative. Sorry, yes, I couldn't articulate well enough, but I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, journalism and ethnography, there's a serious Venn diagram where you see the overlap between those two things, right? They're forms of explanation, they're forms of narrative, forms of cultural description, and so forth, right? And I appreciate the question because many years ago, some of the research that I did for my master's degree was looking at journalistic narratives of the war in Lebanon, actually, just to connect with Cassandra's work. And I was particularly looking at some really influential, first world journalists like Thomas Friedman, who won all these awards for doing this reporting from Lebanon, and who often would make very broad, sweeping cultural statements about the Middle East and about Arab culture and so forth, and sort of act as it kind of like a bad ethnographer, right? And so I think that tension is always there when you're talking about journalistic representations, especially of news from other places, news from other cultures. And one of the things that we try to encourage in our participants in this project is that kind of humility that I talked about earlier, to simply say, I'm providing a particular representation of a moment in time from a limited perspective, right? And be as transparent as possible about what it's based on. So while I was here, I tried to talk with these people. I took these images, or I gathered these bits of paper that were left in the street after the demonstration, and putting all those things together, here's the kind of tentative conclusion that I was able to come to. But to do that in a humble way, rather than in a kind of authoritative Thomas Friedman kind of way, I guess I would say. Cassandra, what are your reflections on that based on your experience?
So I think coming from the global studies department at St. Lawrence, thick descriptions are something that are like very stressed. And we have participants from a range of disciplines, obviously. But that's always something that we try to encourage is like digging as deeply as you can and contextualizing as much as you can from as many angles as you can in order to create a really careful understanding of what you're writing about. Because I mean, and Dr. Collins and I were talking about this pretty recently about like writing responsibly. And I think that that's something that we try to really stress with Weaving the Streets is writing responsibly, because we're representing like topics that are really important to these local geographies. And we're representing them to people who like probably haven't read about it before. Our audience tends to be associated with the St. Lawrence community, but we certainly have readers from a range of different places. But by virtue of us writing about underreported local issues, these are topics that people don't always have a lot of information about. And so it's a really big responsibility to represent that. And so thick descriptions are very, very important. I completely agree. And we go through draft after draft with participants to ensure that we are being as careful and as honest as we can be with the information that we're presenting and the story that we're telling. Because with the privilege to write these articles comes that great responsibility, right? That we're not locals writing, and we shouldn't write as if we are. We shouldn't represent this issue as if we are a local expert on the issue. We need to represent it from the perspective that we do have to offer, rather than trying to hide behind it and pretend that that's not who we are. Because we can't be the local if we're not there being the local, you know? And so I think it's a really heavy responsibility. And I think that we do try to constantly stress it. And we do try to be careful. So.
Thank you for the great question, Yuya, and thank you for the answer. Alexandre has raised his hand, so we're gonna give him now the opportunity to raise his question. So go ahead, my friend.
Thank you very much, Raul. Thank you. I would like to thank both John and Cassandra for their wonderful presentation. I think all of us had the opportunity to listen yesterday to Amanda and Marianne from Weave News. They are such an inspiration. And my question is picking up on what Cassandra said right now about local, about not writing as a local. In Brazil, alternative and community media, I'm speaking from Brazil, is very much associated like counter-hegemonic vehicles with local aspirations. We have this sort of resistance to approach global or international issues often. And I could perceive, seeing the presentations about Weave News, is that American alternative outlets, at least the ones I'm getting in touch through this conference, don't have that at all. Like you assume that it's part of your role as transformative agents to talk about international issues. But I'd like to ask both Cassandra and John how they see, or if they believe there is a tension between the international and the local by definition. So for instance, Cassandra brilliantly said that we try to present these issues to the people of St. Lawrence, north of New York State, if I'm not mistaken. But how do you try to associate those issues with local subjects like rising rent prices, unemployment in the United States, gun rights in the United States, or let's say gun violence in the United States? How do you try to do that? Do you try?
It's a great question. I think if you look at it from the point of view of our organization as a whole, which is sort of broader than just the Weaving the Streets project, I would say that yes, we do make some efforts to make those connections, in part because we do also cover local issues here in what we call the North Country of the Northern New York. And in some cases, those issues are reported by students who come from elsewhere and bring with them, you know, their own local perspective from their own experience. It's a struggle. I mean, as somebody who teaches about kind of critical analysis of news media in particular, you know, I'm very aware that like the way that American media tend to represent issues elsewhere is often through a very narrow set of kind of national security frameworks, right? Which very quickly identify, are these people U.S. allies or not? And that's the only thing that really matters, right? And so with Weaving the Streets, I think a big part of what we're trying to do is to just sort of cut through that or just bypass it and say, you know, what are the people saying and doing in this place? I mean, at some basic level. And then that enables us to then turn around when we look at what's happening in our own town. And we've had some very powerful issues happening up here over the last couple of years, particularly inspired by Black Lives Matter. And a lot of discussions, very intense discussions about police violence up here in Northern New York. And so, you know, our student reporters have been attending these kinds of protests up here and trying to understand as let's say temporary visitors to this area, what are people up here saying? How do they feel about police violence in their community? What about all those Blue Lives Matter flags that we're seeing in the streets up here? And how does someone from another country coming up here make sense of that? So that's very much like philosophically where we're at. But I think one of the challenges for our organization has been like integrating all of this different type of coverage that we do, right? So how great would it be if we could have these Weaving the Streets articles, you know, connected in a more deliberate way with the local coverage that we're doing up here. So I take your point on that, Alexandra. It's a really important one.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for the question. We have about 8 minutes, so I think we can either entertain one more question or comment from our colleagues in the audience, or just leave John and Cassandra a few minutes for their final remarks. So if there are any questions or comments, this is a good time to go for it. Just open your microphone or put your thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. If I could just say, if there are any folks who have thoughts about sort of the second question that we identified, I know we don't have the screen share up right now, but we were also wondering about how a project like this can be or could be integrated into different types of educational work, you know, both from the kind of, let's say, formal teaching perspective, but also thinking about it forms of informal education and so forth. So how can the experience of doing this kind of reporting be built into that? But also how could the analysis of this reporting be built into different educational contexts? And so whether it's now during this session or offline, we would love to hear from students, educators, anybody who might be interested in building this kind of work into what you're doing.
That's an incredibly good question. I mean, right now, like, I don't even have an answer. I'm just trying to cut down the awkward silence. But I think it's a good question, and it's one that we think in terms of critical media literacy. It goes deeper into the question of how do we help critical media literacy enter school curriculum. And I think projects like these, for example, I'm thinking of subjects like social studies or languages, like as an English teacher myself, I'm thinking, how could we do something like this, integrate this idea of urban journalism, where our students get to use English to report the stories and create their own spaces like With the Streets, and if whether that would be a possibility as we go forward, how we empower the students to create this participatory, or for example, or podcasting as another possibility for that. So I think that's a good question to ponder. And I think folks right now are just scratching their heads trying to think of the answers. So I assume the silence as a collective head scratching, or like, damn, that's a good question. Don't assume it. I would just say, I read the room and say, don't assume that we are oblivious, that we're like, oh, we're scratching our heads like, damn, that's a good question.
To me, the reaction is that I'm not sure if anything I have to add to what, say, Cassandra demonstrated, right? The kind of reflexivity about one's perspective limitations, to the impossibility of this kind of like description of the true story, to the awareness about the local global tensions. Those are like already very, very pedagogical elements that you're hitting with the project. I would think that as a kind of like a semester-long study abroad project, this institutional limitations, or this kind of force, the university college is forced to protect students, and the tension between that protection and this kind of sort of authentic learning of local culture, that kind of tension, and perhaps you've encountered some moments of negotiation with the institution. So I think it's already there. So like, I was like, I'm not sure if there's any other kind of innovative idea for me to suggest, at least. I think that reflective, if those reflections are embedded in the project as a follow-up with the writers and so on, I think that's fantastic pedagogically.
Thank you. We appreciate that. I think we're probably running short of time here, unfortunately, but I just wanted to say, and I'll let Cassandra say a last word as well, but we're very grateful again to all of you for engaging with this work. We're excited about where this project is going. We would love to be in dialogue with any of you about the next phase of this project, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you everyone for being here. I'm thrilled to have been able to talk about this project because I really do think it's amazing work that